But yeah, so quantification. So this is the last technical challenge. A lot of this is very recent work, a lot of open questions as well, which I'm going to highlight in the lecture. But quantification as a whole aims to revisit all the other previous technical challenges, essentially trying to answer the question, we have built big multimodal models. We know that they are useful, but how do they actually work? And what are their core limitations? So we're going to segment quantification into 3 parts. The first part is all about understanding heterogeneity that exists in the data and what the model captures. What the model captures in the difference between modalities. Interactions, we know that there's 2 modalities, they're connected and they interact and they try to infer a new variable or label. What are the interactions captured by the model? And finally, because we work on machine learning, how can we better quantify all aspects of the learning process in these multimodal models? So a very general categorization. The first 2 are quite specific to multimodal data. Recall these are the 2 big definitions we had in the first lecture, right? The fact that different modalities exhibit different dimensions of heterogeneity. So how are they actually captured by a model? And the second big dimension is that all these modalities are connected and interact in some way. That's why we want to model them together. So are our models actually modeling these interactions? And last one is a more general machine learning one on just the learning process. So just as a refresher on heterogeneity, we saw this spectrum, right? We saw that it's a spectrum from modalities that are more homogeneous to modalities that are more heterogeneous, right? And we saw examples of the fact that similar modalities can be images from 2 cameras, and you can start getting more and more different by going to text with different languages and language and vision and even other more different modalities. And we also saw these 6 dimensions of heterogeneity. You recall these are going to be relevant. Element representation. What are the most basic units within each modality? Element distribution. How frequently do these individual elements occur? How frequently are there words in a sentence? How frequently are there time steps in a time series sensor? The structure of the data. Language is hierarchical, related structure. Image is a more spatial structure. The information contained across modalities. The types of noise each modality is sensitive to. Language is sensitive to typographic mistakes. Audio is sensitive to misspellings, misspoken language. Relevance. So what information each modality actually provides in the context of some particular task. So as you see, quantification is all about studying all these different dimensions of heterogeneity. Dimensions exist in data, and we know that these dimensions are what we want to capture in our multimodal models. But can you actually formally quantify how much each of these dimensional heterogeneity exists in data and how much each of these dimensional heterogeneity are actually getting captured by your models? So for a lot of these, they're quite open questions. People don't really know how to quantify, for example, what's the right structure for a lot of different modalities. We know how to do it for a simple ones, like language and vision. It's not really clear for the other ones. But just as an overview of some existing work, right? So a lot of work has gone into studying modality biases. So modality biases basically look at heterogeneity in information and relevance. Essentially, what happens is one modality provides a lot more information to your task. It's a lot more relevant to your task than the other modalities. There's going to be some imbalance. And as a result, one phenomenon that people see is this phenomenon of unimodal biases, where one modality tends to dominate the prediction and the other one just collapses. It's not used at all. So here's a classic example, right? If you have VQA, and this happened to ask questions about bananas in a VQA data set, and just because most of the bananas, almost 80% of the bananas in VQA data set are yellow, when you ask a question about what color is the bananas, just by saying yellow, you're correct 80% of the time. Right? So you actually have a green banana in testing, you're very likely not going to actually detect the color. The model is just going to ignore that color. And that's an example of one modality, specifically the visual modality, containing a lot more information that is relevant to the question than the language modality. So what can you do then? 2 general approaches. If you have time, you can balance the modalities. You can try to make sure for each particular question, you see 50% one answer and 50% examples that show the other answer, right? So over here, there was an original VQA data set. VQA 2.0 data set essentially came in and tried to balance all of these images and text so that both modalities contribute equally by virtue of how they're collected and how they're annotated. Another general way of doing it is balancing training. If you're able to get both examples, yellow bananas asking about color and green bananas asking about color, you can artificially penalize your model to make sure that they're given different outputs because you know the inputs are different. So again, some hacks to balance training to make sure all your modalities are used equally. Again, all of these seem to be heuristics to fix the problem. It doesn't really solve the fundamental challenge at hand, which is how do you measure the fact that different modalities have different amounts of information? But yeah, that's a big open question. So. Another example of heterogeneity in information. Again, one modality containing more information than the others, and therefore leading to biases. So right here, this is an image captioning model, right? You give the image, you run it through an image captioning model, and you get the output text, a man sitting at a desk in front of a computer. And you start realizing, why did this image captioning model capture the man instead of woman? And then these folks basically realize, if you look at the attention maps on this image, instead of actually looking at the person when generating a description about the person, they're just looking at the laptop image, right? Essentially, they're capturing a spurious correlation between the object, the laptop, and the type of person using a laptop. Ideally, you want a model to actually focus on the person while describing a person, right? So again, if you know what the right attention map should be, you can also kind of regularize the attention on the model to make sure they actually focus on the right things. And as a result, actually balance the information assigned to both modalities. It was previously misassigning information to the visual modality because it's just getting bias from language that a certain type of application is used by a certain type of person. So again, imbalance in the information captured by both modalities. And while the previous one was just getting colors of bananas wrong, this becomes more sensitive, right? You can see that when you have different modalities, each contain different amounts of bias and therefore are different in the information they contain, you can actually propagate social biases like this. Another worse example, that was just social bias in one modality, right? We saw that it was associating laptop with a particular gender, so just social bias in one modality. People also subsequently found that you can have social biases compound in both language modality, there exist biases in gender, and also vision modality, there also exist biases in gender. Essentially, this paper basically found that if you train a multimodal model like VLBERT, that integrates both of these modalities and allows you to kind of complete the next token, the biases actually increase as compared to the language-only version of the model and the vision-only version of the model. Right. So again, ideally, you will be able to solve this problem if you could exactly quantify the amount of information and social biases within each modality. But again, that's a big open question. But so unfortunately, some of these problems still exist in multimodal models. Very quickly, another example, heterogeneity and noise. We know that different modalities tend to exhibit different noise distributions, right? And people have not really studied this that much. People, when think about multimodal models and data, they always look for the perfect data that's clean and removed from noise, and they train these models on the perfect data, and they benchmark their results. People don't really look at what specific types of noise each modality is sensitive to. So here, there are some benchmarks that basically do such a collection. For example, actually benchmark very specific types of noise that can be introduced to each modality. In images, we actually simulate camera blurs because that's a natural type of noise when you collect images. In text, we actually simulate typographic mistakes. For time series data, they actually simulate chunks of time where all the sensors are missing. And so these are examples of modality-specific noises, and you can also have multimodal noises. If there's some correlation between a modality, such as a video, instead of noise just happening randomly across a video, a structured form of noise specific to these modalities is the fact that for a whole chunk of time, everything is missing, language, video, and audio. Right? So here are ways to actually test the specific types of noise that can be present in each modality. And from this quantification, what do the authors find? They basically find that if you plot robustness, so how slowly your accuracy drops as you increase the types of noise, and you also plot the overall performance of these models on clean data, there's basically very weak correlation, or specifically a very weak negative correlation. Basically meaning that the best models are mostly clustered around those that are not so robust, and a lot of the models that are robust also don't perform that well, with some exceptions. So essentially, you can actually quantify, do a deeper analysis on quantifying the types of noise that these models are sensitive to, and the takeaway is that models are still quite sensitive and not robust to different types of imperfections. Several ways of dealing with noise to better deal with heterogeneity in noise. Again, these are not complete and they don't seem to work in all cases. One is if you know what type of noise a model is going to be sensitive to during testing, you can also simulate these types of noise during training, right? So normally you just train with XA and XB, two modalities perfectly present. But if you know that you're going to encounter missing modalities during testing, you can supplement these during training. So basically do modality dropout during training. It's not going to be perfect, but at least alleviates the distribution shift between what you see during training and what you see during testing. If you know that there's going to be specific modality noises that you see during testing, like specific image noise, specific text noise, you can also add these during training, right? Make sure your model sees them before they're actually getting deployed so that they actually learn from both clean data and noisy data. The second general approach is to infer missing modalities. If you know that some data is going to be missing and imperfect, you can try to use one modality to try to infer the other. And once you make a good inference of what the other modality should be, use the inferred version in place of the imperfect version when you're actually deploying the model as a two modality inputs. So you can do this inference by translating from one modality to the other. Again, there's some references here. Or you can do this inference using a joint probabilistic model, right? So using ideas from generative models, they enable you to actually generate or translate between two modalities. Again, this isn't perfect, right? If you want to be able to translate from one modality to the other, the only modality that you can translate is the intersecting information, right? You can't get unique information in B by translating from A. That's just not possible from information theoretic perspective. All you can do better is to capture the joint information between A and B. Any questions so far? Any questions about, we're talking about heterogeneity in different modalities and quantifying at least the information and the noise that can be present in different modalities. Okay. So for that truly to be quantification across many different modalities, you also need natural benchmarks for many different modalities. Right? So a lot of the class, we use language and vision as an example because it's easy to illustrate. When in real world, when you really want to study heterogeneity, you actually need to go to benchmarks with much more than language and vision and audio. So basically, multi-bench is basically a benchmark that actually contains many different modalities from many different domains, including some relatively unstudied domains like robotics, finance, HCI, multimedia, and so on, and across different challenges, right? And there's some really cool data sets here. There's affect recognition across language, video, audio. There's also robotics, you can what the robot is seeing and what the robot is touching as your two modalities. And also in healthcare, the different time series sensors of the patient's data, biological data, and also tabular information of the patient's background. So these are also some good benchmarks that allow you to do a better analysis of quantification by actually studying the modalities beyond language, vision, and audio, and studying the dimension of heterogeneity beyond language, vision, and audio. It also includes a lot of models if you want to play around with it. And we're also implementing these models in a composable way so that you can actually disentangle, for example, data alignment with whatever local fusion that you've seen, and whatever training procedure that you can apply to your models. And essentially, what does this tell us about quantification, right? So based on this benchmark, we find one cool thing. It's actually really useful to standardize ideas across different research areas. So we're here for this data set. This is our sarcasm detection. If you take the best model applied for sarcasm detection, you get about 68% performance, 66% performance. And if you just take a model from some other research area that is more studied than sarcasm and apply it over, you already get 72% performance. So standardization across these different research ideas and the models actually helps you improve performance on some of these data sets. And specifically, we find this to be true for some of the relatively understudied ones like humor, healthcare, HCI, robotics, and so on. But there's still some big limitations, right? And this is where the heterogeneity comes in. Do the same models essentially work across different modalities and different research domains? And the answer is no. Right? We take some example like this multimodal transformer. They work really well for the data set they were designed for, specifically some in the video space, language and vision space. But we start bringing them over to multi-sensor fusion and robotics or in healthcare, they quickly drop. Right? So these models are still not really able to deal with the heterogeneity of other modalities and other tasks. And here is just color coded with a specific area, like for example, this transformers work really well for effective computing and some of the multimedia applications, but it starts dropping to robotics and starts dropping when you go to financial time series data from different modalities. So yeah, I think still a big open question. Dealing with heterogeneity across different modalities and classes is still difficult. At least for some of these more specific models, it's not really clear how to get them to generalize better. So it's an active area of research. So using multi-bench, one subsequent work we continue working towards was this high MMT model, right? Essentially this big transformer model that we saw whether it could start encoding and learning representations from many modalities at the same time. This one, right? So last time we saw that this was actually along with the data set of multi-bench. And our goal is to build a single model that can work well for all of them, right? Because we already saw the existing models fail to generalize from certain modalities to the other. They can't really capture the heterogeneity. And we found some promising results, right? And then in the lecture on transference, I ended here because I said that we have this heterogeneity aware model that doesn't completely share parameters and doesn't completely use separate models, but does something in the middle. And I didn't really explain what the heterogeneity aware was actually doing, right? Because that's basically a lecture for quantification. So right here, I'm going to very quickly explain how we actually achieve this heterogeneity aware. How do we actually quantify the fact that two modalities were similar enough or different enough to share parameters? And the idea is basically like this. We take a transfer learning approach. So let's say I have the first modality all the way on the left, triangle. I'm going to train a model from that to the label. That's just a unimodal model. And I'm basically going to see, does this subsequent model transfer to the other modalities? If it transfers well, the exact same model with the exact same parameters is able to predict from some other modality. We're going to say that they're quite similar in nature. If this same model with the same parameters does not transfer well, you see a huge drop in performance as you bring it to the other modality, we're going to say it doesn't transfer that well. And that seems reasonable, but there's two caveats. One caveat is, of course, that you have to train the modality embeddings, right? So each modality is still going to have one embedding layer right at the beginning to tell you what modality it is. Because if you don't have this modality embedding layer, all these modalities is going to be on different scales, different dimensions. It's not going to be possible to use a single model. So there's one small modality embedding that we have to train. But the bulk of the classification layer is still the same, right? We're seeing whether the bulk of the classification layer is able to transfer from one to the other. Second caveat, you might think, this is going to depend very much on what is the best model for the first modality, right? You choose a model for the first modality and you bring it over, and that's just very specific to the first one. It might not transfer to any one of them. So another caveat is that these models have to be, in some sense, general enough so that we already know that they can work reasonably well on all these modalities. So we are just looking at the difference in how well they perform. And specifically, this model that works already reasonably well is like a generic transformer model. So using this, we construct this matrix that basically tells us for every pair of modalities, the distance between each other, the heterogeneity distance between each other. So if one modality transfers really well to the other, for example, red triangle to blue circle, you're going to see the distance between them is quite small, just one. Of course, it's not going to be as good as red transferring to itself, which is perfect, but it's still going to be quite small. It's going to be one. And if red doesn't really transfer well to green, then the red and green entry is going to be 3. So that's going to be larger. Essentially a normalized scale computing a difference in heterogeneity across pairs of modalities. So we call that modality heterogeneity. Another cool thing we proposed was interaction heterogeneity. To what extent, when fusing, for example, red and blue, do they share the same interactions when you're fusing red and green? Right? Sometimes two modalities always show additive interactions. So you can actually use the same interactive parameters for two pairs of them. But sometimes perhaps red and blue requires you to do additive interactions, but blue and green requires you to use, for example, a tensor or attention-based interactions. So surprisingly, we actually find that using the same interactive model transfers well to some of them and doesn't transfer well to some of them. So you can actually distinguish which modality pairs require similar interactions versus which modality pairs require different interactions. So from there, we also build this interaction heterogeneity matrix, essentially pairs of modalities on rows and columns, looking at how these pairs are able to transfer well to each other because they use the same interactions. So following that, we apply clustering on these matrices to essentially obtain parameter groups that minimize these distances within your matrices, right? If we know that red and blue have low distance, we can use the same parameters U1 and U2 to encode both red and blue. right? So that's essentially clustering on these matrices. So that gives you, instead of single separate parameters for all modalities, you're going to get a group where, for example, these three groups means that modalities 1, 2, and 4 can be encoded by the same model. That's the first parameter group. Modality 3 should be encoded separately, and modality 5 should be encoded separately because they have large distances to the other modalities 1, 2, and 4. And likewise for cross-modal, you can learn the interactions between 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 4 and 5 together, but you can't learn the interaction between 2 and 3 with the other ones because they show a high distance, right? The same model doesn't transfer across these interactive groups. And finally, the last step is to first train a model that's homogeneous, that doesn't account for heterogeneity. And the same model, the same unimodal model for all these modalities, the same cross-modal attention block for all pairs of modalities, and then subsequently fine-tune them by splitting apart the parameter groups. We know that, for example, 1, 2, and 4 should share the same unimodal encoders, so they're always the same. So 1, 2 here, 1 here, 2 here, and 4 here. And 3 should have another set of unimodal parameters, and 5 and 6 should have another set of unimodal parameters. Right, essentially fine-tuning them to pull them in different directions as dictated by the parameter groups. And that's how we actually get this, right? We get this basically model that shows some partial sharing across parameters and partial separation across parameters by looking at which modalities are similar to each other with low heterogeneity, and also which modality pairs show similar interactions and have low interaction heterogeneity. Yes, so one simplifying assumption we make here is even though we have like 10 modalities, we're only looking at pairwise interactions. And in fact, by designing these transformers that we work with, they also only deal with pairwise cross attention, right? A to B, B to A. So even just without heterogeneity, just like pre-training and transformers, you don't really do like 4-way cross attention. And also for the same reason, because they don't really scale. And it's really unclear if you need like a 4-way cross attention beyond 2. But that's a good question. Yeah. And basically that's what we found, right? At least with this initial prototype of estimating heterogeneity between modalities and heterogeneity between interactions to design your model, you get a better trade-off that gets both efficiency and also performance, right? You get a curve over there. Cool. But again, this obviously doesn't solve everything. This is like a very implicit way of estimating heterogeneity. So basically, this is a very implicit way of estimating heterogeneity, right? Because essentially you're computing whether a model is able to transfer from one modality to the other. So it's basically dependent on the model. You're assuming that this model actually captures the elements and the structure and the information and so on. But it doesn't explicitly, for example, tell you what's the difference in structure between red and blue, or doesn't explicitly tell you the difference in noise between red and blue. All right. So there's no like mathematical formulas for this. It's just like an implicit way of estimating, because we know that these unimodal networks capture some structure. And we also know that these unimodal networks, for example, capture your element representation and distributions. So therefore, still a lot of open questions. Open questions. One big open question is the fact that quantification and modeling typically has this chicken and egg problem, right? Just take structure, for example. You want to quantify the structure between two modalities, right? So sometimes you want to build a model for them. But if you're able to build a model for them, that means you already know everything to know there is about structure between two of these modalities, right? So does quantifying come first, or does modeling come first? Is really unclear. Another big open challenge is just, are you going to do bottom-up quantification or top-down quantification? Are you going to basically quantify based on the data without knowing anything? For example, estimate the structure in your data, or are you going to do hypothesis driven? Because you already know something that, for example, images have some spatial structures. How do I model this spatial structure, and so on? Noisy and missing modalities. Still really don't know how to deal with that. Modalities that are new beyond language and vision. Right? It's really unclear how to even start working with or dealing with heterogeneity in those. Large number of modalities, as the student mentioned, how do you get all of these estimates, modeling and also quantification estimates to scale beyond 2 or 3 modalities? And also cases where you don't even know which modalities are useful. We've all been in this space where we have an image, we have a question, we know both are important, But if you have a huge set of modalities, like think finance, for example, you have all these different stock prices, you have like Twitter data, you have like sentiment data from news, you don't even know which modalities are useful to begin with. So how do you even build models or quantify the information across modalities? Okay, so any questions about the first sub-challenge on quantifying heterogeneity? Okay, so next one is about quantifying these cross-modal connections and interactions, right? That's a second big dimension in multimodal. And just to recap, all these connections basically refer to the fact that you have two modalities. They're not independent, but there's some relationship between them. There's some shared information between them. And we also saw a few examples of what these relationships can be. From a statistical perspective, two items or two elements from two modalities could be associated because they co-occur. And in semantic point of view, this basically refers to the fact that they actually correspond to the same underlying object. For example, laptop images and laptop descriptions co-occur at the same time. From a statistical perspective, you can also think of it as two modalities being dependent one to the other. You can go further from association. For example, one modality depending on the other, or one modality happening after the other. And likewise, these relationships. For example, one modality could be used for other from a semantic point of view. So all of these are more data-driven ways of quantifying these connections, and here are more domain knowledge ways of seeing what these connections can be. And just also as a quick recap, we know that there's connecting modalities, but we also know there's interacting modalities. And the key difference is interaction comes when there's a label that you want to predict, either a representation or an actual label, like prediction task. And in the lecture on fusion, we also saw one initial way of quantifying these cross-modal interactions. Essentially saying that, let's say we have function f, right? And here's a very general definition of these cross-modal interactions. You have a function f, if it can be decomposed into a set of unimodal subfunctions, f of a on the first modality, plus f of b on the second modality, then basically the only interaction is additive, right? There's no higher order, non-additive or non-linear interaction. So what you can do, if you have a very big complicated model, any model that we've seen for fusion or representation learning, can you take this function f and basically decompose it to the most similar function that is additive in A, additive in B, and with some residual. So how you get an additive function in A is that you basically take expectation over B. By taking expectation over B, gives you a function that's independent of B. The function unique to B is just taking expectation over A, right? So remove any dependence on A, you just have a singular function on B. And then you have this residual called mu. And this residual basically tells you the amount of cross-modal interactions that exist in the data, in a model, right? Because it's some additive functions and any interaction term that cannot be expressed as your additive functions. So therefore, if this additive projection, this fa plus f of b is equal to the nonlinear whatever big fancy method you design, that means mu is really small, and therefore these non-additive interactions are not being captured. So mu basically captures the overall quantity of cross-modal interactions on a trained model kind of data set. So this is an example. I think if some of you remember this was the EMAP method that LP talked about in one of the early lectures. So that was already a glimpse on what quantification could look like. Another insight people had was that this sometimes can be slow because you've got to compute expectations over all of B, basically all your images and all of A, all your questions. And this also gives you only an overall quantity across the entire data set, right? So the whole data set just summarizes one value of how much cross-modal interactions are there in the data set. So another easy insight that you can probably see is that according to the same equation, f exhibits interactions between two features, xc and xb, if and only if the second derivative of f with respect to xa and xb is bigger than 0. Or strictly not equal to 0. And it's easy to see this, right? Any of these additive components, f of a plus f of b, the second derivative is going to be 0 because a and b don't occur in the same term. And any of these nonlinear interactions between f, xa, and xb, you're going to see second derivative not equal to 0. So this actually inspires a very natural second order extension of your current gradient-based approaches, right? We know what gradient-based approaches are. I guess some of you might know what gradient-based approaches are. If you want to take, for example, a sentence and predict the label, you can take the gradient of the label with respect to every word in the sentence. That tells you how important every word in the sentence is for predicting the label. So that's a lot of gradient-based approaches are based on that. But this is basically a second-order extension, right? So one example is that let's say you have this question answering image with this image and this question on how many, like basically how many shapes, how many other things are the same shape. What you can first do is you can put a multimodal model that takes in both of these modalities and predicts a label. Take a gradient of the label with respect to something in language. That's the first order gradient. That's the gradient of the label with respect to tiny yellow shiny object. That's the first order gradient. And then take a gradient of that subsequent vector or normalized vector with respect to the pixels in the image. So that's a second order gradient. Essentially, you're doing the derivative of the output with respect to the first modality and then subsequently with the second modality. And ideally, that should highlight the regions in the image, the pixel regions in the image that actually correspond to tiny yellow shiny object. And these authors actually show that it's the case, right? You actually do get pretty reliable highlights of these tiny yellow shiny objects by taking these second order gradients, essentially allow you to localize the corresponding regions between image and text. Likewise, in VQA, how many birds? First, take a gradient of the output, whatever the model output is the answer, with the word birds. That gives you the first order gradient with respect to XA. And that subsequent normalized gradient, normalized vector, take a second gradient with respect to the bounding boxes in the image. Right? And that actually highlights birds in the image. Over here, likewise, take a gradient of the output with respect to 3 small dogs. That's the first order gradient. Second order gradient with respect to the bounding boxes, you actually highlight the 3 small dogs. So these are kind of capturing corresponding interactions, the fact that you're referencing the same thing in language and images. This is also something cool, although we couldn't see this for all cases. You could also capture interactions based on arbitrary relationships. So this is a video-based sentiment analysis dataset. You first take a gradient of the output with respect to some of the words that you think are indicative of emotion. So in this case, the sigh and the word sad that the person was saying. Take that normalized vector and take a gradient with respect to the facial features of the person. And it actually highlights the also indicative facial region, which is the fact that this person's lips are curled up. So these don't exactly mean the same thing, but the model still seems to be capturing some interaction between these negative words and negative facial expressions. Okay, several other perspectives, and some of these are code and they're based on visualization tools, so they actually have a cool website that you can play with. Let's say you train a model across 2 modalities, predict Y. You can also subsequently look at the influence of both of these modalities, right? So all of these can be done using unimodal gradient-based approaches. For example, taking a gradient with respect of the output, from the output with respect to the first modality, that tells you the influence of the first modality, and also take a gradient of the output with respect to the second modality. That tells you the influence of the second modality. And based on these relative influences, you can then start to categorize what type of interaction it is. If one influence, the influence of the first one is significantly bigger in magnitude than the influence of the second one, that could be an example of dominance. If the influences are neither of them dominate the other, and they're also pointing in the same direction as given by dot product in vector space, that means they're complementary. They kind of reinforce each other in the same direction. And if neither of them dominates over the other, but they point in different directions in vector space, so the dot product is negative, then they can actually conflict with each other. It's an example of a conflicting relation, a conflicting interaction. And they did some analysis also on some of these video-based sentiment analysis data sets. They found that typically language was very dominant. In most of the cases, the influence on language to the output label was much larger than influence for the video and audio labels, video and audio modalities. So language is often the most dominant in sentiment analysis. And also as sometimes language and vision typically complement each other, but there's also cases where, for example, language, vision, and audio actually conflict with each other. And that's a pretty cool setup. And they also have this website so you can play with, I think that part of analyzing the type of interactions, for example, conflict or complement, was just one part of the visualization website. They have a few other parts that you can also look at on this link. And yeah, this is basically showing that you can actually summarize these across the entire data set. So to what extent, for example, in the whole data set, what percentage is dominance, what percentage is complementary, what percentage is conflict. But you can also go deeper at a local level within a single instance, within a single video, which parts are complementary, which parts are dominant, which parts are conflicting. Another cool example is a recent paper presented at CMU. How can you visualize these multimodal transformers? Right? We know that these models work really well. The big black box models. This basically gives a toolkit on analyzing the attention maps of these transformers. And it shouldn't be surprising that you can actually take these attention maps and partition them into vision to vision attention, language to language attention, and your cross attentions, language to vision and vision to language. And we just look at the vision to vision attention, that basically allows you to highlight unimodally which parts of the image are important, right? The surfer, for example. And likewise in text, which part of the text, which words are important. And then you can start looking at these cross attention matrices, vision to language and language to vision. And that tells you the correspondences between your two modalities. For example, you can take a keyword like the surfer. Like for example, this is the attention from the image to the word surfer. You can actually see that the attention maps do highlight the surfer in the image when they attend to the word surfer in text. Cool. And they also have this website that you can play with to visualize some of these transformer models that you've trained. But one problem, as probably some of you have already seen, is the fact that all this quantification is good, right? But it's very much heuristic based and it's very much cherry picked, right? All of these are basically images that you take and you look at whether they look reasonable, they don't look reasonable, and so on. Is there a more principled way of actually evaluating interpretability in general? But specifically, is there a more principled way of quantifying whether you've actually captured cross-modal interactions correctly, right? So here I'm going to show a case study. This is a paper we have recently on two big contributions. The first contribution is to really segment a taxonomy of things that you want to interpret when you train these multimodal models. Segment all these stages that you want to quantify. And subsequently, I was going to talk about how do you best evaluate methods for quantifying these models. So our insight here is to first segment the stages, right? And this should seem very natural to you. If you have this different question answering class, for example, the first stage should be unimodal importance, right? Just unimodally, which words were important in the question that you have to attend to, and which parts of the image are important. Next, cross-modal interactions. We've already seen some examples of this. Does the word red consistently refer to the red shapes? And does the word circle consistently refer to the circles? Representation level. Are there representations that consistently capture the notion of red in feature space? And is there a separate representation that consistently captures, circle? Is there a feature that consistently represents the word circle in feature space? And is there a separate representation that consistently refers to the concept red in the feature space? And finally, do you actually compose all of these predictions in the right way to make your prediction, right? So the fact that you have circles, the fact that you're looking at something above, and the fact that you want to filter whether there's something red, and finally give the answer yes. So you saw examples for unimodal and cross-modal, right? Unimodal was just first order gradient-based methods. Cross-modal can be done using second order gradient-based methods. You can also do representation. Representation can be done like this, right? If you take a feature and you want to assign a concept to this feature, what you can do is you can first take analysis of which data points maximally activated this feature, right? So you look at the data point which maximally activated this feature, and you look at what parts of that data point were highlighted. So here you see a data point, what color is the tire of the second man to the left? And it's actually highlighting a second man to the left when trying to answer this question. But one data point is not enough, right? You don't know whether this feature corresponds to just asking about color or asking about man or asking about ties. You don't know actually which one over there asking about. So what you can also do is global analysis. Look at other similar related data points that also maximally activate this feature. If you have enough of them, you can actually start looking at the patterns, right? Another activated data point is what color is the road sign, what color is the building, and what color are the checkers on the wall. So it shouldn't be surprising that this feature actually represents color. Right? That's a commonality across the initial data point you started to query this feature with, and also other data points that also maximally activated this feature. So this feature asks about color. So how do you actually evaluate these methods? It's difficult because you don't actually have the ground truth. You don't actually have the ground truth annotated that this feature actually means color, or here are the actual interactions between image and text. But one general way is that a model simulation, right? You're basically claiming that if you have a model, you can interpret this model into some pieces of evidence that are human interpretable. One way of evaluating that is basically giving these human interpretable pieces of evidence that you claim to an actual human. And a human should be able to, based on these interpretable evidences, predict what the model would have said. Right? Basically, the human simulating the model's decision-making process by looking at these evidences. So on one hand, if your model was a fully black box and all you gave the human was like all the matrix multiplications and activation units, the human shouldn't be able to predict what the model predicts. And you can't really understand these like big matrices. But if you actually give a step-by-step recipe of how the model makes a prediction, what the model is looking at, what the model composes, what the model actually assigns as the output, then you can actually have a human recreate the model's predictions. So that's the model simulation study. And what we actually find is that you can actually have these different stages. You just tell the human what the model looks at in terms of unimodal importance, what the model attends to just in the image and just in the text. Then a human can recreate the model's predictions 55% of the time. If you also give it the cross-modal contributions, then you get 65% of the time, the human being able to recreate the model. And if you slowly add, for example, the representations and the prediction layer, the human's ability to simulate the model increases. Right? And a key idea here is simulate both the correct answers and the incorrect answers. You want the human to be able to simulate the cases where the model got it correct, and the human also gets it correct. But if the model got it incorrect, and for example, looked at the incorrect parts of the input, the human can also simulate the fact that the model was incorrect. Right. So the key idea here is that you want to use a blind test with different groups of users. One user, for example, just seeing the unimodal interpretation. One user just seeing unimodal plus crossmodal. One user seeing the whole of your interpretation toolkit. And actually compare the ability of these users to simulate the accuracy of the model. That's model simulation. The second one is model debugging. And this is perhaps one of the holy grails on quantification. Right? Can we actually take a model, quantify it by giving out these visualizations or interpretation and so on, give it to a human, and try to let the human find bugs in the model, and subsequently fix the bugs and actually improve the model. This is basically a human-in-the-loop way of automating error analysis. Likewise, similarly, if the model is a full black box, your interpretation was just a black box, matrices, activation functions, there's no way a human is able to find bugs. But if your interpretation method actually highlights what the model is attending to, what the model is assigning as concepts at every step, the human actually has a chance of finding these bugs. So here's an example of that. We actually saw, this is an example I was giving earlier, right? If you look at this feature, we saw that this feature represents color because the data point that it came with was about color, and all the other nearby data points were all about color. So consistently, data points asking about color in the data set activated this feature. So that's all good. And then we started looking at these data points, and we realized that these models were actually catching the cross-modal interactions really well. Right? You're just looking at the wall, it's looking at the building, it's looking at the sign, it's looking at the second man to the left. So unimodal, it was all good. It's asking about color. The cross-modal interactions were pretty consistent. The representation is still pretty consistent. It's talking about color with all of these data points, but still the model was getting some of the stuff incorrect, right? So basically, by looking at this multi-stage approach, we know that a model was getting all of the stages correct. Unimodal, cross-modal, representation, it was just getting a last step prediction wrong, right? So basically, the model is picking up everything correct, but just failing to identify color. Why don't we just give the model more data points involving color? Right? That's the first attempt that we did. Right? Just maybe it's aligning everything correctly, it's just failing to assign blue or like yellow, green, so on. So why don't we just add targeted examples involving color? So if we just randomly add like 500 data points, you get perhaps 1.4% improvement. If you base it on active learning, you get a little bit of improvement. But if you get, for example, targeted examples involving color, you can actually try to fix this bug. Like very quickly, you see a big improvement on this data set. What's actually really cool is that this was actually turned out to be a bug in transformers. Specifically, they were mixing RGB and DGR values. So everything was good, right? Unimodal, cross-modal representation was all good. It was just that the RGB to BGR flip was actually causing you to misidentify red to blue and green to yellow and so on. So this was cool, right? It was a multi-stage approach. That's why we could isolate the bug to this actual prediction level. But by knowing that, for example, unimodal was correct, cross-modal was correct, everything else was correct. So that's another example, right? Using model debugging as an end case study to actually test whether your quantification methods were accurate. But still a lot of big challenges. One big challenge, and a lot of these challenges don't just apply to quantifying multimodal models, they apply more generally to interpreting machine learning models in general. One big issue is faithfulness, right? There is still a mismatch. Do our explanations accurately reflect what the model is actually doing? That's a big open question. And again, we saw that this is difficult because models are complicated, but also it's difficult to evaluate whether your quantification method actually reflects what the model is doing. There's no ground truth label for these. There's usefulness issues. One of this is the reading assignment for this week. Do VQA explanations actually make models more predictable to a human? Right? So it's still unclear what type of information that you quantify is going to be useful to a downstream task for a human. Disagreement. There's many different interpretation methods proposed. First order gradients, second order gradients, looking at attention maps, looking at representation features. They actually generate different explanations each time, right? So it's unclear how to resolve this disagreement issue. If one interpretation method tells a human this, and another interpretation method tells a human something else, how does the end user resolve this? And finally, evaluation, right? It's still unclear. Just because of the lack of a ground truth, how do you evaluate these interpretation or quantification approaches? Any questions so far on quantifying these connections, interactions, and also evaluating quantifications? There's a lot of other open questions too. Some of you might remember this slide from the very first lecture. We've only kind of scratched the surface on cross-modal modality interconnections, right? In fact, there's so many different types of redundant, non-redundant interactions based on whether two modalities give the same response or different response. And subsequently, so many types of new responses that can come out, right? Does one modality dominate over the other? Does one modality modulate the other? Is there new information that emerges? There is no known way of formalizing any of these in mathematical or experimental data sets. So kind of figuring out this whole spectrum of cross-modal interconnections is still a big question. So one thing that seems promising could be information theory perspective. Here's just a very rough sketch of figure. Very rough figure that basically kind of combines some of these visuals from information theory with some of these interactions. Like redundancy is all about the fact that there's shared information between two modalities, that the Venn diagrams overlap. Non-redundancy is all about the fact that there's unique information to each modality. The Venn diagrams are separate. And if you have redundancy, it seems that some of the responses basically look at the intersecting parts of both modalities. And these could be equivalent or they could enhance each other. And if you go to non-redundant space, depending on where the Z, where the prediction label is, you could actually get different types of upcoming interactions. Again, this is a rough sketch. None of these are exactly formalized. They might not be accurate. But information theory could provide a way of kind of categorizing these types of cross-modal interactions. Another big challenge, cross-modal interactions beyond just additive or linear or non-linear. There are things like causal, logical interconnections. We've seen a little bit in reasoning, right? How do you better quantify these in your models? still a big open question, right? Two modalities can interact with each other in a causal way, in a logical way, beyond just the, all of these additive or linear ways. Okay, very quickly, the last sub-challenge, the learning process, right? So learning process is all about characterizing the learning and optimization challenges when you start learning from multimodal data. And here's perhaps a compelling example to kickstart this discussion. Here's a kinetics data set. Your goal is to use RGB information for the videos, audio information, optical flow information to predict the activity in these videos. And just like any multimodal task, you would expect that the more modalities that you have, the more the performance it is. But many people find the contrary. You can actually add more modalities, like fuse, for example, audio and optical flow, or audio and RGB and optical flow, but multimodal fusion just doesn't really help sometimes. And I'm sure you've seen this in some of the other data sets as well, right? You might get really good information from one modality, but the other modality just gives a marginal improvement, or sometimes doesn't even give improvement. So we saw some examples of this, right? We saw the nature of heterogeneity. Some modalities just contain more information than the others. We saw it from the perspective of interconnections. If two modalities don't have interconnections, there's no shared information. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to fuse them. This last one will take a look at a different point of view, a learning point of view. And the main reason here is that multimodal networks are just much bigger than unimodal networks, right? You need to have encoders for each modality. RGB is hard to deal with. Audio, optical flow is all hard to deal with. When you go to video space, you have to add a temporal dimension. So your models just get bigger and bigger. And when your models get bigger and bigger, we know from a machine learning perspective that it's more difficult to train, it's more difficult to optimize, and you also run the risk of overfitting very easily, right, with more parameters. So this paper basically found that there's two explanations for dropping in performance. Specifically, these multimodal networks are bigger and they're prone to overfit due to increased complexity. First reason. Second reason is that these different modalities overfit and generalize at different rates. Right? You might finish learning from the first modality, easier to learn from, and then start ignoring the other modalities. And this paper just proposed one solution. Again, but these are all big open challenges, formalizing a learning process of multimodal data. What this paper did was we know that different modalities overfit at different rates. Why don't we explicitly control our learning process so that you're getting the best of each modality at the right time? Essentially computing the time at which each modality overfits, the overfitting to generalization ratio, and try to balance your training by looking at which modality is already overfit and not learning any more of that modality, and which modalities are still able to generalize and haven't overfit, and learning more from that modality. But this doesn't come for free, right? Basically, to compute this generalization or fitting ratio for each modality, you can't just train a single fusion model, be done with it. You got to train a fusion model, but at the same time use unimodal models to actually compute the ideal generalization rate for each modality, right? And basically, if you have XA and you train it, there's going to be a sequence of when it's generalizing and when it's overfitting, that curve, and you're going to compare that curve with what XA is actually learning in the multimodal setup. So you need to keep both the multimodal model and unimodal models, right? And they basically found that this helped. But again, it helped to balance generalization. It helps you learn better from all modalities equally, but you have this issue of having to keep separate unimodal models. But yeah, perhaps unsurprisingly, many open challenges. Any of the learning, generalization, optimization challenges in high-dimensional settings, essentially where P is much larger than N from a statistical point of view. How can you bridge, for example, high-dimensional statistics? We just studied this to some extent with the recent empirical deep learning literature on multimodal. A better formalization of modality shortcuts and biases, which is a big a negative aspect, which is a big result of, for example, modalities not learning equally. How do you do dimensionality reduction or modality selection or approximate inference on these big multimodal models to make sure you learn better? How do you reduce time and space complexity using model compression, more efficient models to make sure they have a smoother learning process? And so all these go into challenges on the learning process. And finally, the whole goal is to revisit all of these previous technical challenges, like the previous 5 technical challenges, in the lens of quantification. For example, can we better understand heterogeneity when we do representation fusion or coordination or factorization? Can we look at how heterogeneity affects when we should do transference, right? Can we look at how heterogeneity should influence how we should do generation? Right? All of these individual parts of the box are right now, to my opinion, open challenges. Okay. Any questions about quantification so far? Okay, well then, conclusion. We see many examples of modalities, right, in this course. We've seen examples of language, audio, visual, and hopefully some of the examples we see have also touched upon the touch modality for robotics, physiological modality in the healthcare, and these mobile data modalities. But at the core, some like maybe 10 slides of big takeaways from the course. The first big takeaway, what a modality is. A modality refers to a way in which something is expressed or perceived in the natural world. And when we think about these modalities, we always got to think about these sensors that correct these modalities. Raw modalities are ones closer to a sensor, such as speech signals to a microphone, images from cameras. You can then start processing these modalities slowly to get more abstract information, like extracting language from speech, detecting objects from images, and likewise sentiment and object categories as you go more abstract. Right? So multimodal, therefore, is always a science of learning from multiple modalities. But from a more research-oriented perspective, is a scientific study of modalities that are different from each other and therefore heterogeneous and also interconnected with each other. So you want to learn from both of them. Interconnected has 2 parts. Connected, which is just 2 modalities, how much you share information or unique information, and also interacting, when there's a label or representation or output that you want to be involved in. We saw heterogeneity, right? Heterogeneity should be seen as a spectrum from more homogeneous modalities with similar qualities to more heterogeneous modalities with different qualities. We also saw connected modalities, right? The fact that they share some information that relates them. And we saw also examples of how this shared information can actually manifest in data, whether they're just associated with each other because of correlation, or is there some domain knowledge telling you that they're actually related to each other because one element is used as a function for the others. Interacting modalities is all about when there's a label, for example, Z, either a representation or a label or something that you want to generate, and how that influences which connections are actually used in the interaction. We saw some cool examples of all this whole taxonomy of interactions and multimodal data, right? First, starting off redundancy and non-redundancy, whether modalities agree on the prediction or disagree on the prediction. And then we saw, if they agree or disagree, all the different types of interactions that should subsequently come out. But still, quantifying all of this is very difficult, right? Are there like better information theoretic ways of formalizing and quantifying what redundancy means, what non-redundancy means, how does it link to the subsequent interactions that we observe empirically? So first big takeaway, multimodal is a science of heterogeneous and interconnected data. Second big set of takeaways is that we looked at multimodal machine learning, and that's all about taking in all these modalities, which we know they are heterogeneous and interconnected in nature, and learning either representations, labels, or generating another modality to take advantage of the different modalities that you have. And just to quickly recap, we saw 6 big challenges, right? Representation looked at taking in all these modalities. We know that there's elements across modalities. We just focus on 2 elements at one time. We can have representation fusion between 2 elements, representation coordination, and representation fission, right? And all the big difference is whether you're learning more, fewer, equal, or more representations, and there are modalities. We also looked at alignment. Instead of just dealing with single local elements in fusion, now we want to look at all elements across the entire modalities. And alignment is all about taking advantage of the internal structure across these elements. The fact that there's spatial structure between the elements in images and hierarchical structure between the elements in language. So for alignment, we saw the fact that if they're discrete in nature, you could learn these discrete connections. If they're continuous, you got to do the additional step of segmenting or warping your representation space. And finally, how do you take advantage of these alignments between modality elements to learn better representations. Given that, reasoning was all about taking in all this information and learning this good multi-step process that robustly predicts a label, right? And typically people do this using just multiple layers of neural networks, but ideally you want to do this in a processed way, in a robust way that actually takes into account the structure of the problem. And by structure of the problem, we mean the structure in which you want to compose your data, the intermediate features, whether it's attention maps or words, and finally, the external knowledge that you require to actually inform your reasoning process. And we saw several and the next one was generation, right? Instead of actually predicting a label, sometimes you might want to summarize, translate, or create more data. So we saw how the interconnections changed in each of these problems. And also we saw generative models that actually could generate data at a high quality. Transference was about taking in a more resourceful modality to actually help you learn in some other modality that has very little data or noisy data or imperfect labels. So we saw examples of code training. We saw examples of leveraging big pre-trained models to help you in the other modality, and so on. And finally, quantification aims to revisit all of these by taking a deeper look into how heterogeneity is quantified, how the interconnections can be evaluated, and what can we say about the learning and optimization process in these models. So those are the big challenges, right? Typically, you always have representation from local elements followed by alignment of multiple elements. Ideally, you want to do reasoning to get to the label. And sometimes you also want to generate more data or transfer information from one modality to the other. It'd be great if everyone did reasoning to make sure their models are more robust and interpretable. But sometimes people just bypass reasoning by just using like many layers of neural networks. And finally, quantification is all about retrospectively looking at all of these previous challenges in the context of multimodal. And finally, just a few slides on future directions. And I hope you'll talk about a few more of these future directions and go more in depth into the papers on Thursday. But one big challenge is that of heterogeneity, right? We motivate heterogeneity a lot in the lectures, but right now people still work with more homogeneous space. When you take images and you have text, you first bring them into clip space. And when you go into clip space, which is representation space, they're actually quite homogeneous together. So are there benefits? And if so, how can you actually deal with actually learning from these raw modalities which are very different in nature? So some of the big challenges, right? Some of these modalities can have arbitrary tokenization. Sometimes it's not really clear how to segment, for example, the objects in the image. If you have high frequency force sensors or speech signals, it's not super clear how to even discretize them into individual elements, right? So these are cases where more heterogeneity is involved. Sometimes when you have more heterogeneity, you also have to go beyond the simplified interactions that you can learn with neural networks, right? How do you actually learn causal or logical interactions and better integrate them with neural networks? And how can you also learn brain-inspired interactions in the context of neural networks? A second big challenge is that of high modality. A lot of applications nowadays look at few modalities, language and vision, sometimes even audio. How can you actually go to high modality spaces where you have graphs, robots, LiDAR, sensors, medical data, and so on, right? And there's two big challenges. The first big challenge is non-parallel learning. Right? If you have all these modalities that you want to learn from, it's very, very unlikely that you see all of these modalities in parallel at the same time. You might see language and vision. You might see robots and vision and perhaps graphs. You might see language and human brain activations. You're going to see subsets of these modalities across different data sets that people collect. But how can you learn from all of them at the same time? Right? That's non-parallel learning. And as you go to high modality, it shouldn't be surprising that you're going to encounter certain modalities that have less data or like fewer labels or noisy labels. How do you deal with that? So multi-bench, for example, is just one resource for high modality learning. The next direction is long-term, right? A lot of the modalities that we see so far have structure across these elements. Like, for example, words have some structure into sentences, image regions have some structure into the whole image. But many of these have only short-term structure. There's not that many elements that comprise an entire modality. How can you actually go to long-term learning? Right? For example, if you want to learn from an entire textbook as a modality, or an entire 1-hour YouTube video as a modality. Right, so over here, you're going to see some issues of compositionality. How do you do compositionality across elements from a very, very long duration? And that also requires you to store some of these elements in very effective memory systems across long durations. And finally, how do you personalize this, right? Especially in many of these long-term applications that are human-centric. Interaction, right? A lot of work that we've seen in representation and reasoning are still based on perception, right? How do you just identify things? But sometimes you want to model this loop where you first perceive, then reason, and then generate, and we do this repeatedly. How do you actually build real systems that are capable of multimodal interaction? And one big example of this is eventually building towards social intelligence, like building AI agents that are able to perceive humans, reason about humans, and actually interact with humans across a long-term duration, repeatedly over these 3 steps. And there's some big challenges. The fact that you got to deal with multi-party interactions, the fact that you want to learn with better deal with causality to actually attribute certain things that you see with underlying phenomena in the world, causality and not just correlation, and also the ethical implications of building social intelligence. So here's one data set, social IQ, some of you might have seen it. And also, we're actually teaching this course on advanced topics in social intelligence next semester. So that's the LTI course 11866. So if you're interested, you could actually register for the social intelligence course. 11866 is going to be a special topics course on social intelligence. It's going to be more discussion based. So students are expected to read papers, going to have discussion groups to really formulate the technical challenges of building AI that can achieve social intelligence, social perception, social reasoning, social interaction, and so on, and the ethical implications of building socially intelligent AI. It is 6 just for the course and 12 if you also do a project. Yep, social intelligence and interaction. Real world, we actually want to deploy these multimodal systems in critical cases, like doing healthcare decision support, and autonomous vehicles, in online learning and education. But to actually get it working in the real world, we have to contextualize these multimodal models, making sure they're more robust, they're more fair, and they're actually more generalizable to the real world. So a lot of the questions in quantification are actually going to be revisited here. So for example, Multivis, which is that visualization tool that you saw in quantification, actually looks at how you can actually get these models working and understandable by humans in the real world. So that was the 3rd pillar, right? Why? What is next? Right? Some ideas are actually going to modalities that are more heterogeneous in nature, high modality, many modalities, long-term interactions, learning from textbooks, learning from very long videos, interaction between perception, reasoning, and interacting with the real world. And finally, when you actually deploy these, what are some of the critical safety concerns? So if you want to see some of these open questions addressed, we also have this advanced topics and multimodal course. That's 877. So social intelligence is going to be 866, and advanced topics and multimodal is going to be 877. Both of these are designed to be discussion courses. So every week we're going to give a topic. For example, this is multimodal co-learning. We're going to give a list of open research questions, and we're also going to give a list of papers that we think are critical that obviously don't solve the open research questions yet, but are required to even start thinking about these open research questions. And likewise for the social intelligence course. So there's 6 units for the course, for both courses, just for discussion and participating in the readings and discussions, and 12 units for also doing a research project. And for then, the research project is going to be expected to have more high quality and maybe even answer some of these open questions. Right. But yeah, that's all. LP is going to come on Thursday, and he's going to talk more about more about these open research questions, and even talk about some of the papers in detail, addressing some of these research questions. But otherwise, hope to see some of you at 866 social intelligence and 877 advanced multimodal next year. Thanks.